Hey everybody, it's Todd Linder with LaunchPoint, and I am so grateful for Millie Welsh to be on this call with us because Millie has an incredible story from transitioning from ministry into the marketplace, but also now has a really cool job. And I'm excited for her to share that story with you and give you some insights into how she got to where she is right now. So Millie, thank you so much for being here with me.
Thanks so much. It's fun to be here with you. It's always good to talk to Todd Linder.
So fun. So I just want to start from the beginning for you. What was your journey into ministry like, and what were some roles that you held before making the transition into the marketplace?
Yeah, awesome. Well, my journey into ministry was very unexpected because I actually grew up a missionary kid, and my parents were with a parachurch organization. And I was one of 5 daughters who swore I would never, ever, ever do anything like that. So that was not my plan. But I went to a small private Christian college, and most of the way through had zero plans of going into anything remotely close to ministry. But when it got to my senior year, I just knew that I needed to do something more meaningful and with purpose. And I knew that I knew about the gospel and how to share it. And most of my friends in a Christian college didn't. And so I thought, okay, I need to do my time, and I'll do ministry for a couple of years, and then I'll go back to grad school. Well, that couple of years turned into 27. Wow. And so once I started ministry, I just never looked back. And I was like, oh my gosh, I was made for this. And so I was in college ministry for 27 years, half of that on campuses around North Carolina and Kentucky, and then the last half of it in the Southeast regional office and in Atlanta. And so for 15 to 18 years doing leadership roles, from everything from regional director to leader development and coaching and all of those kind of things. So I always say I got more training in that nonprofit ministry than probably I know of any company that does training. So I feel very, very indebted to them for that. So it was a long journey, but very unexpected.
Yeah. And 27 years of that. So initially you were drawn to ministry, said, I don't want to do that thing. You're a missionary kid, been there, done that. You lived that life. Senior year, realized, no, I want to do something that's more meaningful, more impactful. Thought it'd be just a couple of years. 27 years later, still helping out with that ministry. So it sounds like you were both in the field, kind of like on the ground doing the work, and also held some more like central and corporate roles. Yep. What was some of the differences between those?
Yeah, I was on the field for the first half because I started off just a staff person. And then when I became a director, the goal from there went more from just leading some people to leading the whole campus. And I loved that. I loved it so much that I swore I would never do the regional roles because that wouldn't have been as fun. But as time went on, it really became a stewardship factor. When they had asked me to consider a regional role, I knew it was about influence and stewardship to be able to have the ripple effect go further than just one campus. And so it was not what I wanted. I said no at first because I was having too much fun and doing what I loved. But then I thought, okay, this is about stewardship. They have invested so much in me and grown me to be a leader. I'll give that back and do that to other people. So merging into that regional role, where my first regional role was coaching the campus directors. So then my emphasis was on the staff who were still with the students. So it's just everything I am is investing in people. That's just always what I've done and what I do. Mm-hmm. And so it just was making it investing in the staff, and the students were not my top priority. But then I still had access to students and still went on summer mission programs and was with them and just loved that. That kind of kept me fresh and kept me knowing what they were really dealing with. So I didn't get off into the ivory tower and just make up stuff. But I was feet on the ground, being able to visit. And I loved what I love is visiting the people and the teams and coaching them. And so that's what I did for most of the last remaining years as a regional director.
Yeah. And so just to give everyone some context, Millie, you and I have crossed paths multiple times, but most recently have actually gotten to work pretty close together, separate organizations, but getting to partner together. And you're what she's saying, everyone, is she's so right. Her heart and her DNA is just to invest in people and coach people, and everything revolves around that for her. So my big question for you, Millie, is you spent 27 years doing a lot of what you felt like was how God created you, was like right up your alley. But you did make a change from working in ministry and a really amazing tenure in ministry into the marketplace. So you did
Yeah.
make that change. What made you decide to make that change?
Yeah. I would say probably the last 3 to 5 years of being in full-time ministry, I started getting that little inkling. I would actually joke and people would say, how long have you been on staff? And I would say, oh, 25 years, looks like it's going to work out. Like I would joke about it. And then as I started really reflecting and going to the Lord to see just where my future was, I started thinking, would I ever consider leaving? And once that thought got in there, then I would sort of think about it. Little opportunities would almost always arise. Somebody would ask me to come work with them at a church or something. And I would think about it, and I would always hold it very open-handedly, and then just wasn't the time. Really what motivated it, towards the end of my career with that organization, I was doing lots of public speaking across the whole country. And I was having a huge opportunity to speak at conferences and retreats and things like that. And I loved it. And I thought, and I was also a communication coach with that organization. And so I loved doing that and wanted that to be more of my job, and had also led to the level regionally that there was nowhere else to go. And the only place to go after that was a national or executive level. And I just knew me. At this point, I was in my 40s. And so I knew that my gifts aren't in high level leading, looking out years in advance with vision. My gifts are with the people. And so I did a little bit of a proposal with most of my friends were in the top leadership at that time. And I made a proposal. Hey, what if I did this? And they weren't for it at the time. And so I said, I have to go. And it was just absolutely obvious that it was time to go, because there just wasn't any other role for me to do what I do best in that. So it was very amicable. Still love that organization, love people in it. My best friends are still there, and I still stay in great touch, but it was very obvious that in order for me to be me and live out who God made me, I needed to move on. And then so what wasn't obvious is move on to what, and what does that look like? And that is where, because of knowing who I was and how I'm wired and what my gifts are and my strengths, I just knew what to look for. And that led to me looking at a small startup company in Atlanta that was a co-working space. And another friend of mine from where the group I had worked with worked there. And he was like, come help me start this location. And he's like, you're going to have to do an entry-level role, but you can do it. It's just going to be beneath you, but get in there, get your foot in the door, and we'll get you into development later. And so I did that. And it was probably some of the most humbling 3 years of my life, because as I did get in there, it really was fun. I loved that company, loved working there, but I was doing a job that any entry-level 21-year-old could have done. And it was starting to get really hard. But as the couple of years passed, then I did get into the development role with them and did that for 5 or 7 years. And it was a blast. So much fun. Pandemic hit, and I actually got to do a lot more of what I do. Lots of team building, lots of coaching, because they actually had time since there were no actual customers. But as the pandemic ended and they just had to rethink some things, they decided to dissolve my role into the general managers that were there, which in a business sense, I understood. In a personal sense, super hard, really, really hard. Still love that company, do consulting for them, but it made sense. And so
yeah,
I'm kind of spoiled because I did not have to look that hard for that. I didn't even do interviews for that. I mean, before that job, it was like I knew I was leaving, and then that job was offered. And so a lot of what people experience with trying to figure out what do they do, I did not have to go through that at that time. So that was kind of a blessing.
I want to rewind for a little bit because it is a huge blessing. And I want to point out a couple of those things that you said that I think are really important for people who are thinking about this transition. First, it was an amicable transition, and that's really important. And I think that gets overlooked a lot of times as people stay thinking that like something's going to work out and you can like force your will upon things changing. And that was my story leaving my job. Is I just didn't agree with some things, and the way that like my direction was headed, very similar to you, Millie, is had this kind of like coaching role that I really loved and this people development role. But I saw that the only way for me to gain responsibility was to do less of that. And I didn't want to give that up. And so I kind of had to make this like decision. But for me, I did not have the clarity that you had to just say, you know what? If it's not going to work out, it's not going to work out. And that's okay. I tried to force myself into the mold. And it left me with I'm sorry to say, with some bitterness.
Sure.
And the way that you did it, I think, is such a great example for people who are realizing, because I talk to a lot of people like this, they realize the future for me is this isn't going to be a fit for the future. And you can try and you can have the right conversations exactly like you did. You can make a plan. You can say, hey, what do you think about this? But if they say no, then it's good to leave on good terms. And the fact that you still have amazing friends that work there is a testament to that. But the other thing that I think is really important is just understanding yourself and being more attuned to how God's created you as you look for the next thing. And for you, it was development. It was developing people. And that helped you to have the right conversations with the right people that led you to be able to do that type of work for a little while in a more like workplace environment. You did, I want to hone in on and ask you more about, you did say you basically took not a step back, but like 10 steps back, realistically, to this entry-level role, kind of starting over in this startup. It was working with someone you knew, so you could trust that what they had to say, they were actually going to get you into a position. But you spent time there and it was hard. Can you walk us through what that sacrifice, the mentality behind that was? Because I know a lot of people feel like, well, I'm going to have to start like step back, but I don't want to start over. So can you walk us through a little bit more about that experience and the mentality as you were moving in that direction?
I would say it's probably been some of the hardest stuff to have to go through, just because of being with 27 years in one job. It's not like I left in my 20s or 30s. And so what was more humbling than even job wise, because I did the job and loved it, it was with people. And so I just had a blast. It was being more, I'll even use the word humiliated, working with people who treated me like I was an idiot and like I didn't know stuff. And I'd be like, oh my gosh, I literally could have birthed you. I do know how to do that. Like I would be like, there's no respect. Like there's no respect. But that's been an interesting, probably for the last now 10 years, an interesting, like I have researched to find stuff about the older generation working with younger generation who leads them. And there is hardly anything out there. There's generation stuff, but how do I lead up for people that are half my age? And it is hard and it is not easy. It is just, there's been nothing easy about it. And so remains to be true to this day. All three of my most recent bosses are way younger and way less experienced, but where I feel like God came into that was just more in the humility aspect. I think I remember leaving full-time ministry knowing I probably needed to be knocked down a few notches. I think there was definitely some arrogance that I was dealing with, and definitely was like, God, wherever you need to humble me, let's do that. Dumb prayer, stupid prayer, don't ever pray it. That's the worst prayer ever, because then he answered it and it's been for 10 years. So just learning how to keep my mouth shut, how to encourage, the people leading me, because I know what they're going through. I've been through that, and they're trying to figure out what they're doing. They're trying to prove themselves. I don't want to be intimidating to them that I want their job. I don't, or didn't, and don't. And so I don't have answers for that other than a literal day by day before I walked into work going, it isn't about what I'm doing. It's the influence that I'm having with people around. Leadership through influence is something I've had to really take on the last 10 years, because I had leadership with title and influence. And now I just have leadership with influence. There's not a title that goes with it. And so it's still to this day is a struggle, and it's hard. But I feel like like what you said earlier, just the knowing myself to know what I needed to go into. And I knew that needed to be a culture, a company culture that's fun and a lot of people interaction. I did consider going into consulting and met with a few of my friends that do that. And my number one question was, do you get lonely? And they said, every one of them said yes. And I'm like, I'm not doing that. I mean, I might do that down the road, like in a full-time capacity, but I need people, and I need a company with a culture that fits my values and what I like and what I love. And so it was worth it to me to take a few steps down in what I was doing. I mean, and I raised my own support with the organization. I took a pay cut to go into that role, which is like, what? So yeah, that was fun. But it's just taking time. And that's where I just was like, it isn't about the pay. And I'm single, so I wasn't looking to provide for a family, but I was like, okay, this is worth it. I'm taking a pay cut because I want to do this. I like this company. I like what they stand for. And so I would say very much it was worth it to do that.
And thank you so much for helping us to walk through that process with you, because the reality is in ministry, it works a little bit differently in terms of leadership experience than most companies. Is when ministry, you get thrown in really quickly into responsibility and leadership. And it's kind of like you pick it up and you do it.
Yeah.
And nobody's gonna like baby you. And if it fails, it's on you. And if it succeeds, well done. And there's support, but it's a lot of like, all right, take it, run with it. In workplace, in marketplace, that's not the case. I had to learn this coming into my first job out of ministry. Is no, you stay humble until you get raised up. And there's scripture on that. Jesus speaks to that. The book of Proverbs speaks to that. But it is very much until you are given the opportunity to be raised up, you don't go to the seat at the table next to the head of the table. That's just not what you do. And so I'm just grateful for you sharing your experience on that, because I think that's going to be really helpful for a lot of people as they prepare, even if they make a lateral move. There's still a lot of trust that has to be built. Just because you have position doesn't mean you have influence. And that's a lot of what you experienced. Is you can still have the influence, but the position cut. That's where it comes into the kingdom, right? As we're thinking, like, what are we really doing here? Are we really vying for position? Well, if you need money to provide for your family, then yeah, probably so. But ultimately, we're here working for influence in the right way. So I'm just super grateful for you sharing that. Did you, in that transition, and maybe you didn't, and I'd be super interested to hear, you said that you had you left that first organization and you kind of rolled into the second one. What were there any challenges of like trying to identify what was next, or trying to get your foot in the door at any companies once you were leaving your ministry position?
There really weren't, because I didn't have time. The ministry stuff ended. I was given a little sabbatical time, like a sabbatical for an off-ramp type thing. And the next opportunity came up during that. So I never even looked, which is just, I think it's just God's grace at that time of life. That was an easier transition than the one of leaving my last company and going to the company I'm with now, which I still was given some time, but that took a little bit more networking and talking to people. But it really was I had talked to some friends that had all left the same organization within years. And we had all observed that almost no one left that full-time ministry role and went to the next thing, and that thing stayed the thing. It was like, that's always just a step to get you out. And then it might last a year or two, and then something else comes along. And I've seen that with almost every friend that left, including myself. Mine just was like 7 or 8 years. But to be able to go, and that's where my prayer was to leave full-time ministry, was more, God, you just got to tell, what's the next step? And I'd coached students for years not to think, what am I going to do with my life? We don't know what we're going to do with our life, but we can know what our next step is. And so it was just, what's my next step? And then it was just kind of like the step was provided. And so I didn't have to look that hard, but that was because it was kind of handed to me in a friend saying, come work with me, which was such a blessing.
I want to dive into that a little bit, but right before I do, that mentality of what's the next step, not one of the things that we tell people is one of the first things you need to do is find clarity for the job that you want or the job type that you want. But really it's not like the forever. It's just for the next thing that you want to do. Just get clarity for that next step that you want to do. And I think that's so important for people to understand is sometimes it is really hard to make the transition out of ministry. And the easiest way to make transition to a job that you actually want is to have a job in between.
Yes, exactly.
And so that's super helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think, I mean, I know there are people who are big time planners, 10-year plan, all that stuff, which I laugh at because I'm like, one of my favorite verses is it's in James 5:14 or something, where he says, who are you to go around boasting about what you're going to do and what business you're going to start? We don't even know what tomorrow holds. Instead, we should just do this or that. And I live by the let's do this or that. And that's kind of personality, but also to be able to go, what's just the next this or that versus lifetime. And for younger people, I think that's super important because they get so overwhelmed thinking they have to make their lifetime job. So few people are in lifetime jobs right now. So, I mean, I was an enigma just doing 27 years. That wasn't even normal. So I'm like, what's the next thing? And I think we are so fortunate that we do have the leadership of the Lord in it to be able to go, God, you've got to lead me. And I'm going to move towards something, but you will have to reroute if that's not the thing. And then if I take it and it's not the thing, I can get out. I can quit. So to me, it was really big to be able to go, what's just the next thing?
So helpful. Now you said something, you said that you just were kind of like handed the next job. And I think a lot of people watching this be like, I would love that. I would love to just be handed the next thing. So how did that kind of go about? Because you knew the person who handed you the job you used to work with. So walk us through kind of how that went down, because I think my hunch is you're going to bring out some really key insights for people as they're looking to make a transition.
Yeah. I would say that opportunity, the one that was even more helpful was leaving that role to go to the one I'm in now, because it was so much both are tied into networking. And it wasn't about, I will say, it wasn't about me having a big, awesome resume. I don't even know if anybody looked at my resume. But it was about knowing people and talking to them. And so for leaving ministry, it literally was praying a lot and starting to explore companies that I thought did what I liked. But then I didn't actually ever talk to somebody until I talked to this friend of mine. And it's funny because I was like, okay, God, I'm not gonna initiate with him. You let him initiate with me if I should work for that company. But then something changed my mind a couple of days after thinking that, and I texted him, and he's like, I've literally been waiting for you to contact me. I wasn't going to contact you unless you contacted me. And so it was one of those like, oh my gosh, I could have missed out on that opportunity. So I had to be so in tune with the nudgings. And honestly, I feel like in that time of life, with which anybody watching this who's in that process, the absolute crucial nature of being so connected to the Lord to listen and hear and pivot was absolutely what got me through it. And then the same thing with the next job. It was the next one, again, no formal interviews, networking with people who did companies that were like-minded to the company that I loved and did things that I loved, and friends that were already in those companies, and just saying, hey, can I come have coffee? Can I just ask you questions? It wasn't interviews. It wasn't even one friend I asked, hey, will you look over my resume? Is the one that connected me to the job I'm in now, because she heard what I want to do. And she goes, you need to talk to my friend. And then that happened. And then this job happened. So I am a pretty big believer in, yes, your resume does need to look good, especially coming from ministry. I would tell anybody to pay for somebody like, oh, maybe Todd Linder, to do stuff with their resume that translates ministry language into the work world, because that's huge. In ministry, most ministry stuff, what is it, Jack of all trades,
Jack of all trades.
And so you're overqualified for everything, but it's crazy, but you got to get the language right. So I would say people need to do that. I just didn't actually have to. So
yeah. I want to hone in a little bit on the more of what you mean by networking, but just quickly on the resume. Yes, you need to translate your resume out of Christianese.
absolutely.
That's important. So think about, like, if you're watching this and you're in ministry, you're probably really smart. You probably know some like Greek and Hebrew. You probably went to school. Imagine taking the original text to your congregation, to the people from the stage, and preaching in the original language, in Greek, in Hebrew, in Aramaic. People would look at you like you're a crazy person.
Right.
And they would leave and not come back. And
Yep.
the reason is because you're not speaking their language.
Yep.
Same thing with the resume. You can't speak Christianese to the director of marketing if you're trying to get a job. You got to speak marketing language. You got to speak operations language. So to Millie's point, 100%, it is important. But the networking piece, I think, is even more important than that. And so when you say networking, Millie, sometimes I talk to people and I will avoid the word networking because some people, the introverts of the world, and a lot of people who that feels icky to, are like, no. I like everything shuts off, red lights. I'm going to sleep. I don't want to do the networking thing. What does that actually mean for you when you say that?
I'm glad you asked, because I would be the first person to say, I do not go to networking events. I would hate that. And I'm an extrovert. Networking, what I mean, and putting it just in business terms, was I literally sat down, and because I live in Atlanta, it's a big city, a lot of companies where CEOs know each other. I wrote down what I would call partner companies with the companies that I had worked at. And I wrote down partner companies where I knew they had similar cultures. And then I looked at each of those and jotted down if I knew anybody that worked there, which I typically did because I'm old. And then if I didn't, I would put it in LinkedIn and see if anybody worked there that I knew or that somebody I knew, which I probably, and so with the friends who worked at somewhere, I would say, hey, can I come visit with you? I'm in the process of looking for my next move. I'd love to just hear more. It very much wasn't an interview. It was connecting with them over lunch or coffee. Can I come hang out and ask you stuff about your company? And so I remember one friend in particular, he would have been the hiring person. And I'm like, I'm not even sure I want a job. I just want you to tell me about the company. I also want you to help me know, what do I need to do to make this transition from this company to the next? So I was seeking his advice. And then I remember it clear as day, walking out of his 15th floor Midtown apartment building, walking down in my car and going, I love so much of what they do. They are brilliant people. I love what they do. I do not want to work in that culture. I need to be in a more laid back, fun, loose culture. And so that was just good for me to be able to compare what I was visiting, because I was going to their places. So where I thought, oh my gosh, I would kill to work with them, when I went there, I'm like, no, I wouldn't. And it was just by going to visit my friend. So that's where it wasn't networking in the full sense of going to a networking party from 5 o'clock to 7. It was finding friends I knew connected to companies that I liked and basically interviewing them.
Yeah.
And that was really, really helpful.
And if ministry, spending time in ministry has taught us anything, it's how to go get coffee and ask people about themselves.
Oh, yes. We are
So
professional connectors.
yes, so you're already good at this.
Yeah.
So I love that. And the thing that I think what's really important, Millie, is two things. You came into the conversation humbly with the mentality of like, I'm here to learn. I'm not here to ask you for something.
Yep.
Because people will, if they want to help you and they can, then they will. They
Absolutely.
will connect the dots. People will connect the dots. You don't have to go in guns blazing, resume in hand,
Right.
like
Right.
pen, ready to sign a contract. They will connect the dots.
Yep.
But it's also, you said this a little bit earlier, it's also, you went to people and told them like what you were looking for.
Yeah.
Whether they could get you a job or not, whether they were the hiring manager or not, it's I want to do this type of job. And it's just a matter of time before someone goes, oh, you should talk to that person. Oh,
Yeah.
let me connect you with that person. So you coming in with that mentality and with that clarity, super important.
Yeah.
And I'm so glad you shared that, because
Yeah.
that is key. Those are keys to success for sure.
Well, and can I throw something in there?
Yeah.
You did not ask me to do this. Those of you listening, Todd did not know I was going to say this, but because I have worked with you, knowing some of what you do, thinking about people in their 20s and 30s doing this, if they don't know themselves well, that's what you do well, is help people learn in the career pathing, what that looks like and how to tap into that. I was at an advantage because I'd had 2.5 decades of growth. And so changing jobs in my 40s wasn't about figuring out who I was. I knew who I was. It was figuring out what job was going to fit and how was I going to still serve the Lord and steward who I was as in my gifts through a company that was going to pay me to do that and enjoy it and love work. I'm determined to love work because I think we're supposed to. So the stuff you walk people through to get to that is incredibly helpful because I've watched it. So I think for people that are younger and haven't had somebody do that, they are at a loss to know how to do this without help. So I think you do a great job of that.
Well, thank you for saying that. I do think there's, in some places in ministry, I think particularly with the role that you were in, you had a pretty clear structure of what you were doing. But then there's some people in ministry where they're doing, I think you said this earlier, like jack of all trades, you're doing everything, or you're like the teaching pastor, you know, like all I do is like write talks and speak in front of people. Like, how does that translate?
Yeah.
It does take time to figure out what you're good at. And you can do that through experience. You can do that through assessments and then getting coaching, or you can take a blend of that. But either way, what Millie's talking about is it is important to know those things going in. And one of the things that I spent a lot of time in talent acquisition, both in church and in corporate, the hiring manager knows if you're someone, or just whoever you're talking to, they know if you are someone who's looking for a job or the job.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a very clear difference between I just need a job and this is the job that's going to fit me. And the way that's received by that person, totally different. And the way their brain's going to work and the way they're going to want to network you, totally different. This happened to me because when I made the transition, I was not super clear. I think I was in my late 20s. And so I was still trying to figure that out a little bit. And the advice, because I didn't come with clarity, the advice I would get is, have you read this book? Have you listened to this podcast? And not, you should talk to this CEO who's hiring for this position.
That's so interesting. Yeah.
It's a very different route. And it's just a little bit of extra effort to figure that out, which I think Millie probably contributed, besides being an awesome human being and besides being super networked and really well connected. I think that did help to contribute with like, okay, you talk to these people and just point out what you did to actually go and not just have phone calls, like go in person, if at all possible, and go to offices. If
Yes.
there are offices, go, because seeing the culture. I just think about like my father-in-law as a financial advisor, for example. I think what they do is really great. The way they go about it's awesome. You walk into their office and it's super swanky. It's like high rise and downtown and super cool. But you sit around long enough, it's like, oh, this is kind of stale.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's fine for some
Some people might want that.
but for people like you, that's not a good fit. So you got to go and see it.
Yeah.
Man, Millie, so much wisdom coming out of you right now. So what I last kind of thing for you on this has been so amazing. What would you say is your number one, if you had to give any one piece of advice from someone who's making the transition from ministry into the marketplace, what would you say is your number one piece of advice?
Oh man, number one, I'm going to have at least two.
That's fine.
Well, I said this a minute ago, and I'm not like tongue in cheek saying it. I do think when it took me a good 2 to 3 years to know God really was, I feel like it's as important as being called to ministry to be called out of ministry. And so it took me a 2 to 3 year period to know he was calling me out of ministry.
Yeah,
and in that process, I'm a student of people. I always have been, always will be. I watched people who left crash and burn and have the most massive identity crisis because ministry was their identity. And I remember thinking, I will not let that happen, because I watched it. It was like watching people it was so sad to me. And I'm like, I cannot do that. And so being very aware of where is my identity coming from, and I cannot let it be ministry because I'm about to leave it. And so then where will my identity go? And so I was very proactive with that, about being aware to watch for it and to be careful. I think there still is an identity crisis. I just don't know how you don't have one, especially as long as I was with one organization. But almost more like watching the storm, like seeing, okay, the storm's coming. What am I going to do to go through the storm? And so that did happen. It's like what I was saying earlier, leaving with no title, but still having influence, but nobody knew what I did before. And so when they would ask me a demeaning question that I'd done 20 years ago, I couldn't say that. I just had to take it and know my identity isn't in this entry-level job right now. And I just had to constantly remind myself and give that to the Lord. I failed. There were occasions I failed. Typically when I failed, it was when I would say out loud, oh, yum, blueberry humble pie today. And that's when I failed and wasn't very good at eating the humble pie. But being able to know my identity isn't in my job. My identity is who I am in Christ. And the job can be anything, but I want to steward myself best. And so I'm going to try to find something that stewards my strengths and gifts and passions. So the first thing is just being incredibly sure that God's calling somebody out of ministry.
Yes.
And then the second thing was what we talked about earlier, the absolute necessity to pull somebody else in who either knows you well and can tell you things you don't know about yourself. You're blind, like help you grow in self-awareness because you're about to look for jobs and you need to have help. Or what would be best is finding a consultant who can do that. I think when people branch out on their own and try to do it without help, like what the stuff that you do, and there are people that do that. There are people out there helping with resumes and assessments so that when somebody does go into those conversations, they can talk about who they are and what they're good at and how they're gifted. I just think it's crucial. I don't know how you look for a job from ministry without being able to put the ministry buckets into the secular buckets and say what you do well. Because there are people that will just write you off, and you don't want them to do that. So being prepared. So really being prepared spiritually and being prepared literally, emotionally and psychologically with all the self-assessment type stuff.
Yeah, so great. And thank you for the bonus piece of advice. They were both amazing. Millie, thank you so much for your time. You're incredible. Thank you for sharing your story with all of us. I'm sure everyone.
I gotcha. Thanks for having me. I love what you're doing. Love being able to follow your journey. Love being able to see all your postings on LinkedIn. It's just cool. I think you're filling a niche that's been out there for a long time. So it's exciting to see people attached to it. So it's fun.
Awesome.
Thanks,
Thank you, Millie.
Todd.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.